I slept alone for years, until my wife's sister whispered at my door one night. David sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the empty room. The curtains were drawn, but the faint light from the street lamps outside still seeped through the cracks. The room felt cold, not just in temperature, but in atmosphere. It had been years since he had felt warmth here, real warmth. Ever since his wife passed away, life had become a series of quiet routines and lonely nights. He had learned to move through the days like a ghost, going through the motions, doing what needed to be done, and returning to his empty home each evening. The first few months after her death were unbearable. Every corner of the house reminded him of her. The way the morning sun fell on the kitchen counter where she used to brew her coffee, the small note she left by the mirror, the soft hum of her favorite music playing in the background. Everything was a memory. Memories that once brought joy now cut like knives. The silence that followed her absence was deafening. At night, when the world outside was still, and even the neighbors' occasional laughter could not reach him, he would lie in bed and feel the vast emptiness pressing down. He remembered the first night alone. It had been bitterly cold, and he had pulled the blanket up to his chin, trying to hold on to some warmth. He had reached for the side of the bed where she used to sleep, only to find nothing but empty sheets. The shock of it had been overwhelming. He had cried quietly at first, but the tears soon dried, leaving a hollow ache in his chest. That was the night he realized that life had changed forever, and he would have to face it alone. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Friends visited at first, bringing food, offering company, trying to help him through the grief. But after a while, visits became less frequent. They had their own lives to lead, their own families to care for, and David understood that. He did not resent them. He just felt more alone. At work, he tried to focus, but his mind would wander, drifting back to moments of laughter, moments of comfort, moments when his wife had simply been there. Even simple things like sharing a meal or walking in the park reminded him of what he had lost. Life outside continued busy and noisy, but inside his home, time seemed frozen. David had always considered himself a strong man, capable of handling hardship, but grief was different. Grief was quiet, patient, and unrelenting. It crept into his mornings, lingered in his afternoons, and kept him awake at night. He learned to live with it, to manage it, but never to escape it. He often found himself talking to the empty room, whispering words meant for her. Sometimes he laughed at himself for doing it, but it gave him a strange comfort. Even if she wasn't there, the act of speaking aloud reminded him of her presence, as fleeting as it was. The nights were the hardest. David would lie awake, listening to the faint creaks of the house settling, the occasional car passing outside, and the silence that filled the spaces in between. He had grown accustomed to sleeping alone, but it did not make it any easier. The bed felt vast, almost like a stage set for a life that no longer existed. He had tried sleeping on the couch in different rooms, even in hotels during work trips, hoping to find some relief from the loneliness. But no matter where he went, the feeling followed him. Loneliness was not a place. It was a companion. And it had made itself at home in his life. Over time, David had developed small routines to cope. He would make a simple breakfast each morning, read the newspaper, go for a short walk, and return home by noon. In the evenings, he would cook for himself, often repeating the meals his wife used to make. The smell of food would bring back memories, bittersweet as they were.
He would eat in silence, sometimes talking to himself, sometimes just staring at the wall.
Television and radio provided background noise, but did little to fill the emptiness he felt. Books were better companions, especially novels with characters who struggled, who hoped, who lived. They reminded him that life went on, even when it seemed unbearable.
Friends who remained in contact often suggested he try dating, meeting new people, or even joining social groups.
David had considered it at first, but soon realized that he was not ready. The idea of sharing his life with someone else, of allowing another person into the space that still felt sacred to his wife's memory, was daunting. He feared that replacing her, even unintentionally, would feel like a betrayal. And so, he continued his quiet life, alone but self-contained, finding solace in memories and small routines. David's family had long since stopped visiting regularly. His parents had grown older, and his siblings lived far away. He was not lonely for lack of people who cared, but for lack of people who understood the depth of his grief. Even those closest to him could only offer sympathy, never fully bridging the gap between his life before and after loss. He sometimes envied those who could laugh freely, who could find joy in small, everyday moments. But he knew that his journey was different, and he had to walk it alone. Best. Yet, there were moments of quiet beauty amidst the sorrow. The way sunlight touched the trees outside his window, the sound of rain tapping against the roof, the gentle warmth of a cup of tea in his hands. These small things reminded him that life still had simple pleasures to offer. He clung to them, fragile as they were, because they were proof that the world had not forgotten him entirely. David found comfort in noticing these little details, in letting them anchor him to the present. Some nights, David would think about what life could have been, but he imagined conversations he might have had with his wife, the trips they could have taken, the celebrations they would have shared. These thoughts sometimes brought tears, but they also brought a sense of closeness, as if she were still watching over him. In his mind, he kept her alive through stories, through memories, through the quiet rituals of living day by day. Despite the years of solitude, David had learned to survive. Daddy had learned to navigate a world that felt emptier than it once had, to find meaning in small acts, to hold on to memories without being consumed by them. He knew that grief would never fully leave him, but he also knew that it did not have to define him entirely. Every night, as he lay alone in the dark, he reminded himself that surviving was not enough. He needed to keep moving forward, even if the steps were slow and uncertain. And so, he lay there that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft hum of the city outside. He thought about the years behind him, about the quiet rooms, about the meals eaten in silence. He thought about the loneliness that had become his companion, and how he had learned to live with it without letting it destroy him. Life had taken much from him, but he had endured. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the ache of loss and the weight of solitude, a tiny flicker of hope remained. Hope that maybe, just maybe, something could change. Something could enter his quiet life and remind him that connection was still possible. He closed his eyes, pulling the blanket tightly around him, and let sleep take him slowly, carrying him into another night of quiet yet somehow resilient existence. One rainy night, David sat in his living room, the soft hum of the rain against the windows filling the quiet house. The clock ticked steadily on the wall, each second a reminder of the slow passage of time. He had just finished a late dinner for one and was preparing to retreat to his bedroom. The house was dark, with only a small lamp casting a gentle glow across the room. He had grown used to the quiet, the solitude. But tonight, something felt different. It started as a faint sound, almost imperceptible at first, a soft whisper, barely louder than the rustling of the rain. David froze, straining to hear. His mind, so used to the silence of his home, tried to convince him it was nothing, just the wind, just his imagination. But the whisper came again. It was deliberate, this time. A single, careful sound that seemed to call his name. Brass. Heart pounding. He rose from the chair and moved toward the door. The whisper came once more, clearer this time. "David, it's me." He paused, peering through the peephole, but the dim light of the hallway revealed nothing. Confusion and caution warred within him. Who could be at the door at this hour, especially in the pouring rain? He considered not opening it, but a strange pull, a feeling he could not explain, urged him to turn the key and open the door. Standing there, soaked from the rain, was Laura, his late wife's younger sister. She had always been kind, always gentle, but they had never been particularly close. Over the years, they had seen each other occasionally at family gatherings, but now here she was, trembling slightly, water dripping from her coat and hair, looking more vulnerable than David had ever seen her. "Laura?" he asked cautiously, his voice both surprised and hesitant. What are you doing here?" She looked down, shivering, and held the doorframe for support. I didn't know where else to go, she whispered. I didn't want to bother anyone, but I needed to talk to someone. Her voice was small, almost broken. David noticed the weight she carried in her eyes, the exhaustion of someone who had been carrying too much for too long. Without thinking, David stepped aside and gestured for her to come in. She hesitated, then entered, shaking off the rain as best she could. David grabbed a towel from the coat rack and handed it to her. "You shouldn't have come here in this weather," he said softly, trying to mask the mixture of concern and curiosity he felt. Laura took the towel and dried her hair, glancing around the familiar yet changed space. I just didn't know who else I could turn to, she admitted. I needed someone to listen. Please, don't ask me to explain too much. I can't keep it all inside anymore. David nodded. He didn't press her, knowing that sometimes words came only when one was ready. He led her to the living room, where the small lamp cast a warm glow. He offered her a seat and went to the kitchen to pour them both a cup of tea. The aroma filled the room, comforting in its familiarity. When he returned, he handed her the cup, perspective, wrapping her hands around it as if it could shield her from the storm both outside and within. They sat in silence for a few minutes, listening to the rain tapping against the windows, the occasional distant rumble of thunder. David didn't push for answers, and Laura didn't offer any. It was enough to simply share the space, to feel the presence of another human being in the quiet house. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper.
I've been struggling, she admitted, looking down at her cup.
Breath. I didn't know who to tell, and I couldn't tell my family. I was afraid they wouldn't understand. I feel lost, and I feel alone. David felt a pang of empathy. He knew that feeling all too well. He had spent years navigating the heavy silence of loneliness, carrying grief like a shadow. I understand, he said quietly. Bree. I know what it's like to feel alone, even when the world is full of people, even when everyone around you tries to help. Around and surprised by the understanding in his voice. There was no judgment, no impatience, only acknowledgement. For the first time that evening, she allowed herself a small sigh, as if a fraction of the weight she had been carrying had been lifted simply by being heard. The conversation continued, softly at first, with pauses, with hesitation. David asked gentle questions, careful not to pry, allowing Laura to lead the way. She spoke of her work stress, of personal struggles, of nights she had spent awake feeling trapped in her own mind. David shared, not as a counselor, but as someone who knew the language of grief and loneliness. He spoke of the years after his wife had passed, of the emptiness he had learned to live with, of the small routines he had created to survive. As the hours passed, the storm outside mirrored the emotional storm they navigated inside. Words that had been unspoken for weeks, months, even years, finally found their way into the open. They laughed softly at small memories. They sighed at shared frustrations, and they sat together in a way that felt like a fragile, quiet connection forming in the midst of chaos. But David noticed something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of presence, of companionship, of emotional closeness. Not romantic, not yet, but human. The kind of closeness that reminded him that he was not entirely alone in the world, that someone could come to him in a moment of vulnerability, and it would be met with understanding rather than dismissal. Laura stayed until the storm began to subside, until the rain softened into a gentle drizzle. When she stood to leave, David felt a strange reluctance, though he did not know why. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaky but sincere. "Breath for listening." Ration. I needed this more than I realized. "You're welcome," he said simply. "You don't have to face everything alone." "Not here. Not with me." Breaths.
She smiled faintly, a small gesture that seemed to carry more meaning than words could express.
I'll try to remember that," she said, before stepping back into the night, disappearing into the lingering mist of the rain. That night, David went to bed with a different feeling than usual.
The house was still quiet, the darkness still enveloped him, but there was a subtle warmth in the air, a sense that life could still hold surprises, that connections could still be made, even after years of isolation. He thought about Laura, about the courage it must have taken for her to knock on his door, about the simple act of seeking someone's presence and being met with understanding. It was a small moment, but in its smallness it held great significance. For the first time in years, David did not feel the crushing weight of emptiness pressing him down into the sheets. Instead, there was a gentle awareness of possibility, of openness, of life moving quietly but insistently forward. He understood that healing did not always come in grand gestures or dramatic changes, but sometimes in the softest moments. An unexpected visitor, a whispered word, a shared cup of tea, a silent acknowledgement of struggle. As he drifted into sleep, he realized that tonight had been a turning point, not a solution, not an ending, but a beginning. A beginning of understanding, of connection, of slowly learning to let the world back in, one cautious step at a time. The house was still quiet. The storm had passed, but David's heart felt a little lighter. And for the first time in years, he welcomed the night. Not as a reminder of loneliness, but as a witness to something quietly transformative, something that might just change his life in ways he could not yet imagine. After that rainy night, life for David did not return to the same quiet solitude he had known for years. The house, once filled only with shadows and memories, now carried a faint sense of expectation. He did not know when Laura would come again, or if she would come at all, but her visit had left a mark.
It was strange, he thought, how one person could enter a life so quietly and yet make everything feel slightly different.
It was a few nights later when he heard a soft knock on the door again. His heart skipped a beat, not out of fear, but out of curiosity and a small, cautious excitement he had not felt in a long time. When he opened the door, Laura stood there once more, holding a small bag and looking hesitant, as though she were unsure whether she should come in.
"Hello," she whispered, her voice carrying the same gentle tremor as before.
"I hope it's okay I'm here again." David smiled softly. "Of course," he said. She stepped inside, brushing away the light drizzle from her coat. David gestured for her to sit on the couch while he poured 2 mugs of steaming tea. The warmth of the liquid filled the room, but more than that, it seemed to fill the empty space between them, a quiet bridge connecting their shared moments. They sat together in the soft lamplight, sipping tea, and for a while, neither spoke. The only sound was the gentle ticking of the clock and the faint patter of rain against the windows. Bind. Finally, Laura broke the silence. I thought maybe we could talk, she said, looking down at her cup, Bud.
I feel strange tonight. I feel like I need to share something.
Not because I have answers, but because I have questions. David nodded. He understood completely. He had spent years living with questions that had no answers, nights filled with memories that would not fade. I understand, he said gently. Sometimes just saying things out loud helps, even if there are no solutions yet.
And so, she spoke.
Breath haltingly, as though testing the water. She spoke of her struggles at work, of personal doubts and fears, of the nights when she had felt utterly alone in the world. David listened carefully, offering nothing but his presence, his attention, and the occasional word of understanding. He did not interrupt. He did not judge. He simply listened, and in doing so, gave her a rare gift, the knowledge that someone cared enough to hear her without turning away. After a long pause, David shared some of his own feelings. He spoke of the years after his wife had passed, the quiet that had filled the house, the routines he had built to survive. Breath. He spoke of the nights he had spent alone, the memories that haunted him, and the small moments that had kept him going.
Laura listened intently, her eyes soft with empathy.
She did not speak much, but her presence, her attentive silence, was as comforting as the words he offered. Over the next several nights, these visits became a quiet ritual. Laura would arrive in the evenings, sometimes without explanation, sometimes carrying a small notebook or a book she wanted to share. They would sit together, talking quietly, their conversations meandering from memories to dreams to the small trivialities of everyday life. Each night, David felt a little lighter. He felt the tight knot of loneliness in his chest loosen, just enough to let in a flicker of connection. One evening, as the rain fell softly against the window, Laura hesitated before speaking. I feel like I can tell you things I can't tell anyone else, she said. Not because I want attention, but because I trust you, I think. Breaths. You understand things I didn't know anyone else could understand. David felt a warmth in his chest at her words. He wanted to tell her that she was not alone, that he was grateful she had come to him, that he had felt the same trust in her presence. Instead, he nodded and said quietly, I'm glad you trust me. You don't have to face things alone. Not here. Not with me. It was during these late-night conversations that David began to see a different side of Laura. She was not just his wife's sister or a distant relative. She was a person with fears, dreams, and vulnerabilities. She laughed softly at small memories, sometimes recalling events from their shared past, sometimes inventing little stories to make him smile. He found himself laughing too, genuinely, a sound that had been rare in his home for many years. They began to share their favorite books and music, discovering tastes and interests they had in common. On some nights, they would read passages aloud to each other, taking turns, commenting quietly on the stories. But on other nights, they would reminisce about the past, about family gatherings, about the small, ordinary moments that had once seemed insignificant, but now felt precious in hindsight. Each night, David felt that the house had grown warmer, that the darkness and silence that had once been so oppressive were slowly being replaced by light and sound, by the soft rhythms of human connection. One night, as they talked late into the evening, Laura confided something deeply personal, something she had never told anyone else, She spoke of a fear she had carried for years, a fear that had made her retreat from friends and family. David listened silently, letting her words fill the space between them. When she finished, she looked at him, her eyes searching for judgment but finding none. David reached out and gently placed a hand on hers. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore," he said softly. "We'll figure it out together." The nights of sharing and trust brought an unexpected comfort to both of them. David realized that while grief and loneliness had marked his life for years, moments like these, moments of openness, empathy, and human connection, were the beginnings of healing. Laura had not come to solve his loneliness, nor had he come to fix her struggles. Yet in their mutual presence they found something profoundly restorative. The simple knowledge that someone else understood, someone else cared, and someone else was willing to share the quiet moments of life with them. Their bond grew gradually, naturally, without pressure or expectation. David felt an unfamiliar sense of anticipation, a feeling that tonight might bring new stories, new laughter, new understanding. He noticed that he no longer dreaded the long nights alone. Instead, he looked forward to them, hoping that Laura might appear at his door, knowing that even the simplest conversation could bring comfort and warmth. As weeks passed, the routine of their late-night conversations became a lifeline. David found himself thinking about her during the day, wondering how she was feeling, what small struggles she might be facing. Grace. He began to notice details he had never paid attention to before. The subtle changes in her expressions, the quiet determination in her voice, the way she smiled at a memory or a story. "I'm at ask!" Perhaps. For Laura, these conversations became a sanctuary, a place where she could be herself without pretense or fear. One evening, after a particularly long talk about hopes, dreams, and regrets, they sat in silence, simply enjoying the calm. The house was still, except for the soft ticking of the clock and the distant sound of cars passing by. Laura leaned back slightly, closing her eyes for a moment, and David realized that they were both learning something important. That healing was not about forgetting the past or erasing pain, but about creating new connections that could help carry the weight of it. David felt gratitude that he had not expected. He was grateful for her trust, grateful for her presence, and grateful for the gentle shift in his life. For the first time in years, he felt that his home was not just a place of memories and emptiness, but a space where something new could begin. He did not know what the future held, nor did he expect to. All he knew was that these moments, quiet, unassuming, and real, were enough to remind him that life could still hold unexpected warmth. As the night deepened and Laura prepared to leave, David walked her to the door. They stood for a moment, the silence between them comfortable, full of understanding. "Thank you for tonight," she said softly. I feel lighter than I have in a long time." David smiled. "You're welcome," he said. "And thank you for trusting me. It means a lot." She stepped out into the night, disappearing into the gentle shadows, and David closed the door behind her. The house was quiet again, but it was a different quiet this time. It was not the heavy, oppressive silence of years past. It was a quiet that carried possibility, a quiet that hinted at connection, at understanding, at healing. David sat back in his chair thinking about the conversations they had shared, about the trust they had built, about the laughter and the tears. He realized that these late-night talks were doing more than just filling the hours. They were slowly filling the emptiness he had carried for so long. They were teaching him that even after years of solitude, life could still surprise him with new relationships, new moments, and new reasons to hope. As he finally made his way to bed, David felt a rare sense of peace. The bed was still wide and empty beside him, but he did not feel the crushing weight of loneliness he had felt for years. Instead, he felt anticipation for the nights to come, for the conversations yet to be had,
for the subtle, quiet changes that were slowly, gently reshaping his life.
And with that thought, he drifted into a deep, restful sleep, carrying with him the knowledge that even the darkest nights could be touched by light. As the weeks turned into months, David noticed that the rhythm of his life had begun to change. The house that had once felt so quiet and empty now had a different energy. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The late-night visits from Laura had become more frequent, more comfortable, and with them came a sense of companionship that David had not felt in years. It was not just the presence of another person that mattered. It was the connection they shared, built slowly through trust, conversation, and understanding. One chilly evening, Laura arrived at David's door carrying a small bundle of papers. She smiled softly, her eyes reflecting the warm light of the hallway. "I thought we could look at something together," she said, her voice carrying a gentle excitement. Breath. "I've been working on some ideas, and I want your thoughts." David stepped aside and gestured for her to enter. He felt a quiet happiness at her presence, the kind of happiness that had nothing to do with the grand events of life, but with the simple act of sharing a space with someone who understood him. She set the papers down on the table and began explaining her ideas, her enthusiasm growing as she spoke.
David listened carefully, asking questions and offering suggestions, genuinely interested in what she had created.
As they worked together, something changed between them.
There was a growing sense of partnership, of collaboration that went beyond words. They laughed together at small mistakes, shared quiet moments of understanding, and found joy in the simplicity of working side by side. For David, this was a revelation. He had spent so many years alone that he had forgotten what it was like to feel part of a shared purpose, to have someone rely on him and value his thoughts. For Laura, it was equally meaningful. She had always carried her struggles in isolation, and now she was learning that sharing could bring not just relief, but inspiration. Evenings like these became a regular occurrence. They would sit together at the table, working on small projects, discussing books, music, or even just life itself. The conversations were no longer solely about personal struggles. They began to explore dreams and possibilities. David found himself talking about ideas he had long buried, things he had once dreamed of doing but had put aside after his wife's death. Laura listened with genuine interest, encouraging him, asking questions, and offering her own perspectives. One night, after they had spent hours talking and planning, they sat back in their chairs, exhausted but content. The rain had returned, tapping softly against the windows, and the room was filled with the warm glow of the lamp.
Laura looked at David, her expression thoughtful.
"Bye."
"I never realized how much I needed this," she said quietly. "I mean, someone to just talk to work with, to share ideas with. I didn't think it was possible to feel this connected to someone after all the years I've spent feeling so alone." David nodded, feeling a familiar warmth in his chest. "I know what you mean," he replied. "I thought I had accepted that loneliness was permanent, but having someone to share the quiet moments with. It makes a difference. It reminds me that life still has surprises, and that connection is possible, even after a long time of being alone." The bond between them deepened naturally, built on mutual respect, empathy, and shared experiences. They began to spend more time together during the day, too. Sometimes they would go for short walks in the park, enjoying the crisp air and the quiet beauty of nature. Other times they would meet at a small cafe nearby, sipping tea and talking about books, movies, and memories from their past. These outings were simple, unremarkable to anyone else, but to them, they were moments of profound joy and comfort. David began to notice subtle changes in himself. He laughed more freely, He found pleasure in small things again, and he no longer dreaded the long nights alone. His home, once a place of silence and memories, was now a space of warmth, filled with the echoes of conversation, laughter, and shared experiences. Laura's presence had brought life back into the house, but more importantly, it had brought life back into David himself. One evening, as they walked through the quiet streets after visiting a small bookstore, Laura stopped and looked at him. "Do you ever think about the future?" she asked softly. "I mean, really think about it beyond the next week or month?" David considered her question. He had spent so many years focused on surviving and getting through each day that the future had seemed like a distant, unattainable idea. But now, with Laura by his side, the concept of the future felt different. "I do," he admitted. "I think about possibilities I never allowed myself to consider before. Things I want to try, places I want to see, even relationships. But it's strange, but it feels hopeful." Laura smiled, a gentle expression that seemed to carry relief, understanding, and a quiet joy all at once. "I feel the same way," she said. "For so long I thought I had to face everything alone. But being with you, it's shown me that I don't. That life can be shared even in small ways. And that sharing makes it better." Their conversations continued to explore deeper aspects of their lives. They spoke about their fears, their regrets, and the things they wished they had done differently. They talked about family, about the past, about hopes for the future. Each discussion brought them closer, not in a hurried or pressured way, but through the gradual building of trust and understanding. David realized that Laura had become not just a friend, but a confidant, someone whose presence was essential to his sense of well-being. One particularly quiet evening, they found themselves sitting in the living room after finishing tea, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. Laura looked at David, her eyes thoughtful. "Do you remember the first night I came here?" she asked. David nodded, smiling faintly at the memory. "I do." "You knocked on the door and I had no idea what to expect. But I'm glad you came." Laura smiled, a little wistfully.
I was scared, she admitted.
"I didn't know if you'd let me in, or if I'd feel comfortable. But that night changed something. It made me realize that I could trust someone again, even after years of feeling alone." David reached out and placed his hand over hers, a gesture of quiet reassurance. "That night changed something for me too," he said softly. "I realize that life doesn't end with loss. There are still connections to be made, still moments of joy, still reasons to hope. And I'm glad I found that with you." Over time, their bond became a source of mutual strength. They supported each other through difficult days, celebrated small victories, and provided comfort during moments of doubt. They shared meals, stories, and laughter, creating new memories that gradually filled the spaces left by loss and loneliness. David began to understand that while grief would always be part of his life, it did not have to define it entirely. With Laura by his side, he could embrace the present and even look toward the future with cautious optimism. The growing closeness between them also brought a sense of playfulness and lightness that David had not experienced in years. They would tease each other gently, share jokes, and recall amusing incidents from their past. These moments, simple as they were, strengthened their connection and reminded them both that life could be joyful, even after pain and loss. As the months passed, David began to notice how much he looked forward to Laura's visits, not just for the conversations, but for the sense of companionship and belonging they brought. He felt a quiet gratitude for the trust she placed in him, and he knew that he too had become someone she relied upon, someone who mattered in her life. It was a reciprocal bond, one built on honesty, empathy, and the shared understanding of what it meant to face life's challenges alone and together. One evening, as they sat side by side on the couch, the rain gently falling outside, Laura spoke quietly. I think we've both grown because of each other, she said. I don't feel as alone anymore, and I think you don't either. David nodded, feeling the truth of her words in every fiber of his being. You're right, he said softly. We've found something precious here. Not just friendship, but a connection that reminds us that life can still hold warmth even after so much pain. They sat together in silence for a long moment, letting the quiet speak for itself. It was a comfortable silence, full of understanding and unspoken acknowledgement. David realized that the bond they had built was not fleeting or superficial. It was steady, patient, and resilient. It had grown slowly, like a small plant breaking through the soil, and it had taken root in both their lives. As Laura prepared to leave that night, she turned to David with a gentle smile. Thank you, she said softly, for everything. For listening, for trusting, for being here. I feel like I can face the world a little better because of you. David smiled back, his heart full. And I thank you, he replied, for showing me that connection is possible, that life can still surprise us, and that we don't have to face it alone. That night, as David lay in bed, he reflected on the past months. His home was no longer a place of silence and sorrow. It was a place of warmth, laughter, and shared moments. He realized that life had a way of bringing people together when they needed it most, often in the most unexpected ways. And he felt a quiet, steady hope that whatever challenges lay ahead, he and Laura would face them together, strengthened by the bond they had nurtured with patience, trust, and care. The months that followed were quiet, but full of subtle changes in David's life. His home, once a place of empty rooms and echoing memories, now felt alive in a gentle, unassuming way. The conversations, walks, and shared moments with Laura had grown into something steady, something reliable, a presence that neither had anticipated but both had come to cherish. David no longer dreaded the nights or felt the crushing weight of solitude. Instead, he welcomed the evenings, knowing that someone who understood him would likely appear at his door, bringing warmth and companionship. It was on one of these nights, a cool spring evening with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of blooming flowers, that David realized how much his life had changed. Laura had arrived as usual, carrying a small notebook filled with sketches she had made over the past weeks. They sat together on the couch, sipping tea and comparing ideas, laughing softly at each other's observations. The simplicity of the evening, the easy rhythm of their interaction, reminded David of how much he had missed feeling truly connected to another person. As the night progressed, their conversation turned to memories. Good memories, not just the ones tinged with sorrow. Laura shared stories from their childhood, moments with their family, and little adventures they had experienced together that David had long forgotten. David, in turn, shared stories of his wife, not in the pain of loss, but in the warmth of remembrance. They laughed at the funny quirks, sighed at bittersweet moments, and allowed themselves to feel nostalgia without being consumed by it. It was during these moments that David began to understand that connection was more than just companionship. It was about trust, about being seen and accepted fully, about sharing life in both its simplicity and complexity. He realized that Laura had become more than a friend, more than a confidant. She was someone who brought balance to his life, someone who helped him see the world with hope and curiosity again. One evening, after a long conversation and a walk through the quiet streets, Laura stopped and looked at David. The moonlight reflected softly on her face, and her eyes carried an emotion David had not seen before. I think we've both healed a little,
she said softly. Not completely, because some scars will always remain, but enough to see life differently. Enough to trust again.
David smiled, feeling the same truth within him. Yes, he replied. And I think it's because we found each other. Sometimes it takes the right person to remind you that life can still hold beauty, that you can still feel alive and cared for. Their friendship had matured into something deeper, a bond that combined trust, understanding, and a gentle affection that neither rushed nor forced itself. They spent more time together outside the house, exploring parks, visiting small cafes, and occasionally going to museums or bookstores. Each outing, each shared experience, wove them closer together. The small moments, the laughter over a spilled cup of coffee, the quiet observation of a painting, the comfort of a shared umbrella in the rain, built a connection that was strong, steady, and profoundly meaningful. David noticed that he was thinking about Laura more during the day, not in a longing or desperate way, but with a quiet anticipation. He looked forward to seeing her, to sharing thoughts, to experiencing life together. For the first time in many years, he felt the possibility of a future that was not defined by loss, but by presence, care, and shared experience. One evening, after a long talk about dreams and plans, they returned to David's home. Laura sat on the couch, her eyes thoughtful. "Do you ever think about what it would be like to live differently?" she asked. "Not just surviving, not just managing, but really living." David paused, considering her question. For years, he had existed in quiet routines, moving from day to day without expectation. But now, with Laura, the concept of truly living felt tangible. "I do," he said quietly. "And I think, with you, it feels possible. Not in a rushed or pressured way, but in a way that makes sense." Doris, slowly, steadily, we can find joy again. Laura smiled softly, a quiet warmth in her eyes. "I feel the same," she said. "I never imagined that I could trust someone again like this." But here we are, finding it together. The seasons began to change. Spring turned into summer, and with it came long walks in the sunlight, visits to quiet gardens, and afternoons spent reading under the shade of trees. David noticed how much lighter his steps felt, how much brighter the days seemed, and how much laughter returned to his life. Laura's presence had become a source of steady comfort, a reminder that human connection could bring healing without erasing the past. One afternoon, as they walked along a familiar path lined with flowering trees, Laura paused and looked at David.
Do you remember the first night I came here?
She asked, her voice carrying a soft laughter. "I was so scared, and you welcomed me in. I didn't know it then, but that night changed everything." David nodded, smiling at the memory. "It did," he said. "I never expected that a single knock on the door could begin something so meaningful." And yet, here we are. They continued walking, talking about small dreams, hopes for the future, and even trivial things like favorite foods and music. The simplicity of these conversations, the absence of pressure or expectation, was what made them so powerful. It was not about dramatic gestures or life-changing events. It was about consistency, trust, and the comfort of shared presence. As evening fell, they returned to David's home. The house felt warm and full, not with noise, but with life. They prepared tea together, laughing at minor mishaps in the kitchen, and then sat down to enjoy it. David looked at Laura, seeing not just his wife's sister, but a person who had transformed his life in quiet, profound ways. He realized that the emptiness he had carried for so long had been replaced with hope, companionship, and the beginnings of joy. That night, as Laura prepared to leave, she turned to David with a smile. Thank you, she said softly, for being patient, for listening, for being here.
I feel like I can face the world now. Not alone, but with someone who understands. David reached out and gently held her hand. And I thank you, he replied, for trusting me, for coming into my life, and for showing me that even after years of loneliness, life can surprise us with something beautiful. After she left, David sat quietly for a moment, reflecting on the journey they had shared. The nights alone, the whisper at the door, the long conversations, the shared walks and laughter. It had all led to this point. He realized that life had a way of bringing people together in unexpected ways, of healing wounds slowly, steadily, and gently. And he felt a quiet gratitude for the patience, trust, and understanding that had allowed this bond to grow. Over the following weeks, David and Laura continued to share their lives in small but meaningful ways. They explored new hobbies together, discovered new places in their town, and even planned short trips to nearby towns, experiencing new adventures with the quiet joy of companionship. The trust and warmth between them grew steadily, and with it came a deeper understanding of each other's hearts. David noticed that he no longer feared the nights. He still remembered the emptiness, the grief, the years of solitude, but those memories no longer held power over him. They were part of his past, yes, but they did not define his present. Laura's presence had shown him that life could continue, that hope could return, and that meaningful connections could still be formed even after loss. One quiet evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Laura looked at David and said softly, "I think we've both found something rare. Not just friendship, not just companionship, but understanding, care, and trust. Something that can grow into anything we want it to. Slowly, steadily." David smiled, feeling a deep warmth in his heart. "Yes," he replied. "And I think we will continue to grow together, discovering the joys of life we almost forgot existed. We've learned that the past does not have to weigh us down, and that the future holds possibilities we never imagined." The days that followed were filled with small joys. Quiet mornings with tea and conversation, walks in the sunlight, laughter over shared memories, and evenings spent in each other's company. David realized that, while grief and loneliness had shaped him, they did not have to define him forever. With Laura by his side, he had found a life of connection, trust, and quiet happiness. And so, the house that had once been a place of shadows and solitude became a home of warmth and life. David no longer slept alone in the emotional sense. His nights were filled with comfort, companionship, and the quiet knowledge that someone cared deeply for it. The whisper at the door, which had once seemed like a small, unexpected event, had changed everything. It had opened the door to a new beginning, a new chapter of life filled with understanding, care, and hope. David knew that the journey of life would continue to bring challenges, that grief and loss would never fully disappear. But he also knew that he had learned a powerful lesson, that connection, trust, and shared moments could bring healing in ways that nothing else could. He had discovered that life could surprise him, that warmth and companionship could return, and that even after years of solitude, meaningful relationships were still possible. As David drifted off to sleep that night, he felt a sense of peace he had not known in years. The house was quiet, the night was still, but it was a quiet filled with hope, understanding, and the gentle promise of new beginnings. He knew that whatever the future held, he and Laura would face it together, strengthened by the bond they had built slowly, patiently, and with care. And with that thought, he closed his eyes, grateful for the journey, the lessons, and the quiet, enduring happiness that had returned to his life.